A while back, I went to lunch with a guy who is a pretty ordinary fellow with an ordinary job. And the waiter came up and he had an accent that seemed Eastern European, I suppose. And my friend just immediately and confidently switched into Russian. I had no idea he spoke Russian. The other guy lit up and they're talking about things. And I was just sitting there awkwardly in my monolingual shame zone. And this went on and on. I guess he ordered some stuff and then the guy switched back to English and I ordered some stuff. And I thought to myself, next time I want to be the one that shames my monolingual friends. So I set out to learn Spanish. How hard could it be, right? I mean, one time I was in Mexico on a tour and some drunk tourists told the tour guide that they had figured out that Spanish was just English with O's on the end of everything. So I assumed I could just go get a book or something and figure out how to do that real fast. Turns out Spanish is actually somewhat hard. So I did a couple exercises on a computer and maybe read a couple pages out of a book on Spanish or something. And the next time I was out to eat and the waitress came up and she sounded like she had a Spanish accent, I seized the opportunity to flex my newfound Spanish muscles. And if I recall correctly, I said something to the effect of, "Puedo tener una pizza, please?" No one at the table was impressed, including the waitress, but joke's on them because I got my pizza. Okay, the point is languages are hard. We've probably all tried to learn a second language at some point. Language is a complex thing, and it's really hard to fake knowing one that you don't actually know. In Acts chapter 2, a handful of guys who probably would not have been linguistics experts all of a sudden can miraculously speak multiple languages. The event happens in public, and there's further physical confirmation that something miraculous from God is occurring, and it turns out to be a pretty pivotal moment in the history of the church. And that's what we're going to look at today. So if you have a Bible or internets, I would be grateful if you would go and read Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. And then we'll talk about it, like friends. Except the kind of friends where I don't actually see you, and I'm just talking into a camera, and then you watch it later, and I don't know that you're actually watching it. That kind of friends. If you've been tracking with me over the last few episodes, you know that Acts chapter 1 wrapped up with the disciples having been sent back to Jerusalem after watching Jesus ascend into the sky with the fresh instruction that they're supposed to wait there until the Holy Spirit shows up with power, and then after that, they're supposed to report what they've seen and heard locally, regionally, and to the ends of the earth. That's going to be the plot structure of Acts. So in the second half of Acts chapter 1, the disciples go back to Jerusalem. They replace Judas, the 12th member of their team, with a new guy, Matthias, and they do what they're told, which is wait. That's where we pick it up in verse 1 of Acts chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Did you see how I could look in the camera because it's short? Luke was writing to an audience who would have known what all these terms and festivals and everything meant, but it's been a couple thousand years and not all of these things are still a big deal to us today. So I like to try to take a minute where I can to fill in some of these blanks so that it's easier for us as modern readers to understand this more in the way that it would have come off to the original audience. In doing so, I think we understand Luke's intentions better than we would by just reading it through exclusively 21st century eyes. So, Pentecost, what is this thing? Well, it's a Jewish festival that happened 50 days after Passover. You'll remember that Passover was going on around the time that things started to really heat up between Jesus and the religious leaders in the events leading to his crucifixion. Pentecost then is 50 days or 7 weeks of weeks after Passover. It kind of makes sense if you think about the name because Penta, 5, 50, and cost. The second half of verse 1 says they were all together in one place. Who are the they? Well, presumably the they are the 120 people that were referenced as gathering in Jerusalem together, waiting for whatever the Holy Spirit was going to do back in Acts chapter 1. Since 120 people are gathered here, we can assume that we're not talking about some gathering that was occurring in a secluded part of a house or an upper room as it had in the past, but instead we're probably talking about an open portion of a house that would have been publicly visible or accessible for people passing by, maybe in a market district of Jerusalem. Verse 2 says, "Suddenly a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting." These guys know what windy days are like. They used to work on the Sea of Galilee. But this verse indicates that they knew there was something supernatural about this. Verses 3 and 4. "They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Okay, now I'm guessing none of them expected that this was how God's promised Holy Spirit was going to show up. But at the same time, it's pretty irrefutable that something miraculous is going on. It isn't just affecting one guy, they're seeing this happening in each other. There's something physical and tangible in these little tongues of fire that can't really be explained in any other way. I'm sure they'd connected the dots by now. I'm a huge fan of science and reason, and passages like this in the Bible, I wouldn't say they're hard for me. They just defy natural explanation. And on the one hand, I feel some discomfort with that because I just can't explain it. But on the other hand, I really like that there's stuff like this in the Bible, because if God really is behind the Bible, who is a supernatural being, then I would expect to see him do supernatural things that defy explanation to make his points from time to time. And I like that when he does things like this, there's really no other explanation for this but God. You know, I get some things can be written off as, well, maybe that was a coincidence, or maybe people just felt in their hearts that it was like this. But we're going to see in just a minute that all kinds of people walked in, they witnessed this thing, they heard these words being spoken in their own language. Either they had some crazy good special effects, or they convinced everybody to lie about what happened, or the witness accounts are reliable. Remember, Luke wrote this within living memory of these events. If Luke wrote these things down and said it was this way, and the people who were there then read this and said, nothing like that happened, I'm sorry, but that account is complete crap, well, that totally shoots Luke's credibility right there. Luke wrote as a guy who knew that his accounts were going to have to pass muster with the people who were actually there. I mean, first of all, he's saying, Holy Spirit is here, this is the work of God, and it can't be explained any other way. But he's also sending a message about what he intends to accomplish next in his big redemptive plan for all of humanity and all of history. And the reason I say that is because he had them speak in different languages. We're going to see in a minute that Jews from all over the world are here, and they're all hearing this thing in their own language. They're all going to go home and tell other people about what they saw here. And so in this introduction of the Holy Spirit, God is doing more than just saying, here I am. He's also helping the disciples in the task that he's assigned them to take this message out regionally and to the ends of the earth. Now, before we move on, there's one thing I want to note here, and that's the use of the word filled. It says all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. The Bible tells the story about this rift between us and our Maker. And through the story, we see God doing this and doing that and bending over backwards to try to reconcile this rift. But one persistent theme is that there's a distance between us and him. But now God has closed that distance by taking on flesh, sending his son Jesus, and then further closed that distance by indwelling people with his own Holy Spirit. Okay. Verse 5. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. I used to live in Missoula, Montana, and we had this horrible intersection there called Malfunction Junction, where all the streets in the entire city crammed into one horrible 17-way intersection. And in my entire time there, I don't think I ever figured it out. Jerusalem is kind of the malfunction junction of the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. If you want to go from Asia to Africa, you're going through Jerusalem. If you want to go from Europe to Arabia, congratulations, you're going through Jerusalem. If you want to go from Egypt to Persia, guess what? I think you're catching on. So everyone from everywhere is going to be passing through this huge cosmopolitan city that was one of the real cultural centers of the Eastern Mediterranean world. If you were God and you were going to jumpstart a movement of people following you and you wanted to make that happen fast, that seems like a really smart place to start. You'll note at this point that we're still talking about mostly Jews because of a whole lot of things that had happened through history involving Babylonians and Persians and Assyrians and Romans and Greeks. The Jews have been kicked around like a soccer ball and have been spread to the four corners of the earth. They've adopted some language and customs in all these different places they've been scattered to, but yet history tells us they've maintained a Jewish identity and a connection with Jerusalem. So a lot of the Jews who would have been present for this event weren't just Jerusalem Jews, they were Jews from the dispersion who were back in Jerusalem doing business, seeing people, worshiping, whatever it might have been. Verse 6. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard them speaking in his own language. Have you ever been on a long trip to some exotic destination, and maybe you haven't heard anyone speaking good old American English for weeks? And then all of a sudden you're at a market or a restaurant, and your ears perk up because somewhere off in the distance you hear someone that sounds like you. I sense the same type of social phenomenon is happening here. Verse 7. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not all these men who are speaking Galileans?" God likes to stack the deck against himself. We see it all through the Old Testament, where he uses means to accomplish his purposes that look like they should never work out. Rather than defeating an army of Egyptians with an equally powerful army from somewhere else, he uses a divided sea and a supernatural phenomenon to accomplish his purposes. That way, when they get to the other side of the water, no one can say, "Well, that was just lucky," or "That's because of great leadership from our guys." Everyone would have to acknowledge that was the work of God. Here again, by choosing to use Galileans, God is making his point that no one but him can receive credit. They certainly would not be the kind of people you'd expect to break out these nuanced dialects and languages from all around the ancient world. The crowd that gathers acknowledges that they don't think those guys are faking it. One, because they're Galileans and they really shouldn't be able to speak these languages. But if that wasn't enough, two, because there are little rolling balls of fire over all of their heads. How did that work? I don't know, but it was there, and I would certainly take notice of such a thing. I'm going to go verses 8 through 11 right now. Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism. Cretans and Arabs, hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. As we'll see when we get into the story of Stephen in chapter 6 and especially chapter 7, Jews from around the Mediterranean world proved not to be very sympathetic right off the bat in Jerusalem toward the teachings of Christ. And it was Greek Jews in particular who were so upset by the teachings of Christ and his followers that they see Stephen stoned. So my point is, this is not a super sympathetic audience that's coming together and is already biased toward believing things about Jesus and has a favorable view of his followers. They probably didn't even know about his followers, though I'm sure they would have heard of Jesus. There's only a group of 120 at this point. When they ask, "What does this mean?" in verse 12, it gives us a pretty strong hint that they don't understand all the implications of this thing. And that's okay, because Peter's going to lend some clarification to that in the passage we look at in the next episode. Verse 13 is fun, though, because this little passage wraps up by pointing out that not everybody was buying it. Some, however, made fun of them and said they've had too much wine. In the coming verses, Peter is going to address that exact critique very specifically, so we'll get to that next time around. But for our purposes right now, I think it's worth acknowledging that Jesus himself pointed out that the miraculous would not convince everybody. In Luke 16, which is worth taking a look at if you have a minute, there's a story about a rich man and a beggar named Lazarus. With the rich man, who has died and is now separated from God, looks up and sees Lazarus, the beggar, in the presence of God and the patriarchs, and he says, "Hey, can you send Lazarus back to go and tell my brothers about how things really are so they won't end up with me separated from God?" And the response from heaven is that even if somebody comes back from the grave, that's not necessarily enough to guarantee that people are going to believe. Skepticism isn't the worst thing in the world. In fact, it's a really good tool for growing and learning and exploring our environment. But at the same time, I think it was a guy named Occam who said the simplest explanation for a thing is often the best. This rule holds up here. The simplest explanation for what these critics had just seen is that something supernatural had occurred. If you were a first-hand witness, you'd have to work a lot harder to come up with a better explanation than that. Here's a quick summary and a couple things to note before I call it quits. First, the priority in this passage is not on the miracle or the event, it's on the response. We don't get any details about the mechanics of how this worked or the physics of how this worked. We're just told there was this wind, this fire appeared, and then people who didn't speak multiple languages suddenly could, and a bunch of people gathered around and could all understand what was being said in their own languages. The event itself, the response, very big. In fact, the rest of chapter 2 is going to deal with how people responded to this miraculous work of God. And Luke is really into pushing his readers to think about this for themselves. We're supposed to see these people wrestling with how they respond and to identify with them in thinking, how will I respond to this? How would I respond if I was there? A second observation, Jesus defined some things about what the church age would look like in Acts chapter 1, and now we're starting to get a fuller sense of what that's going to look like. We still have a long ways to go. Third, this passage hints at a larger audience for who the message of God will be intended. Up till this point, it's been all Jews, all Judaism, all Israel. Everything we've been dealing with is Jesus as the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, that is the Old Testament. And now Jesus' followers are staying in Jerusalem. We're going to see them interact with Jewish leaders. But once we get to about chapter 8 of the book of Acts, this message is going global, and it's not just for the Jews anymore. It's for everybody. And we get a little foreshadowing of that right here. Fourth, just like the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings series who are really underwhelming heroes but still end up being used to accomplish great things, so it is with God's view of people in the Bible. Doesn't seem to be interested in using the most impressive people. He seems to be interested in using very flawed, underwhelming people. Last observation, here we see again God being committed to his plan to redeem everything instead of just walking away from it. And we see that he's really creative in how he pulls it off. This big moment in the history of the church is nowhere close to being finished. We'll pick it up in the next episode as we look at how Peter responds spontaneously to all of this stuff. In the meantime, I really do intend to try to respond to comments or thoughts below. Thank you in advance for being gentle with me as you type. I hope this was useful. My name is Matt Whitman, and this has been the 10-Minute Bible Hour.